A really important strategic concept in chess is that of acquiring ownership of key squares or even a series of squares of the same color, which we call a color complex. So let's take a look at a game that I played out against a student of mine where these strategic ideas came up. My student is a King's Indian player, and he played the very natural move f5, which prompted me to make a trade because I didn't want to see that pawn going further. So we had this exchange. Now, in terms of evaluating this position, of course, we have to talk about material imbalance, like the two bishops' advantage versus the bishop and the knight. Also, the extended position of black's pawns around the king, which is unusual for a lot of openings, not so much for the King's Indian. And like the quality of the bishops, right? So this bishop is really good for black. It's not hindered by any pawns. This one is obviously more of a problematic piece. Like it has a role to play. It's obviously protecting the king. It's protecting h6. But you kind of understand this bishop is the one that can potentially be turned into a bad piece. So for white, white has kind of a similar issue with the light squared bishop with these center pawns on light squares. So they generally don't really need this bishop in this position, and they would love to make a trade. So that is a strategic goal for white, to achieve the trade of light squared bishops, which would basically hand over this very nice square in the center, and just in general, all these squares would be quite weak for black. So you may ask, well, why not just go bishop d3? It's sort of the most obvious way towards the goal. Want to trade the light squared bishops. Well, the problem with that is that sometimes that kind of straightforwardness backfires, and black responds with a very typical pawn sacrifice, e4. You can't take it with the bishop because your knight will be captured with a check and your bishop will be lost. So you have to take with the knight. And then, you can sort of feel that the opening of the position is favoring the bishops. Not necessarily because this pawn is that important, but it's actually more the e-file play that black is going to get. So one sample line is something like queen e7, attacking the knight. Let's say queen e2, and black just developing with knight a6. Well, white needs to get the king out of the center. Black continues mobilizing his pieces and going just knight c5. So eventually, like, the pressure on our position leads us to make a trade like this, and we're going to have a lot of trades that are going to leave black with plenty of compensation in the end game, despite being down a pawn. Because the bishops are just excellent, right? Both of them. You can't really find a flaw with those bishops. And if you would like to save this pawn, you are going to be also giving the rook a tempo to improve. And at some point, it's starting to get unpleasant because you don't even have rook e1. Got to deal with bishop c3. So the point is that the move e4 would be giving black some amazing play, so we can't really afford to step into that. You definitely have to watch out for that pawn push like at every single turn in these positions, because that opens up the poor dark squared bishop. So what I did was I played knight d2. It's a really typical move that tries to establish control over this key square. We want to use the concept of blockade. And it also kind of opens up some potential for, let's say, this bishop to go to g4. Black developed with knight d7. By the way, I guess I should mention that one of the computer's ideas here for black is just sacrificing that pawn. It's definitely like a less powerful sacrifice than what I have just showed you after bishop d3. But it's such an important idea, just in general, to let your pieces open up, that the computer feels like that's a pretty good option for black, even if it doesn't solve like all of black's problems, but it is still the relatively best try in this position. It makes sense. It's a very thematic idea. But black played knight d7, developing a piece which looks pretty good too. And here I continued with the obvious knight d to e4. And I wound up not having any advantage in this game despite playing some pretty natural moves. But I wanted to go over this important moment with you guys and explain what I could have done that would be better than the move knight d to e4. So first of all, one move is the move g4. And this insertion is going to be kind of helpful in one important line, because after bishop g6 knight here, let's say black plays the same way they did in the game and goes knight c5 to challenge our knight, and we go here, they take us. It's actually really important that black does not have a move like g4 here. So the computer evaluates this position as better for white. And it's very interesting material balance of 2 knights against 2 bishops. So you might be thinking, well, how can the side with the 2 knights be better? But it's really because the knight is enjoying the outpost square, and this bishop is severely restricted. So black is not really enjoying the full benefit of the bishop pair. Like, this bishop is good, but what can you do with it? I mean, if you take the knight, it just gets replaced with the other one. So the real problem with black's position is that bishop, and there is just like no good way to improve it. So it's not like white is winning in some fast way here, but it's more of a long-term advantage where black has to play with the bad piece and the weaker king for the long run, and white will be able to eventually improve the position. So having the pawn here is very nice, because if it was back on g3, well, we're going to see that in a second, the difference. So basically, the move g4 was an option for me. And the second option that I had was actually bishop g4. I mean, really logical. Like, we're not stepping into some e4 tempo here. And I don't know why I didn't do it, because I certainly generally understand that the light squared bishop should come off the board. And if black wants to not trade, well, then obviously this bishop is getting really improved, and we can find him on e6 at some point. Right? So let's say bishop g6, let's say they avoid the trade, then we put the knight on the outpost, and then we just support the knight, which is also nice that we have that square available now for the queen. So why is black suffering in a position like this? Yeah, he's suffering because white is taking really good control over the light squares. And I mean, if he wants to try to eliminate this knight, it's not really going to ease the pressure. I mean, you can take it as much as you want, but you see, like, again, you're left with very weak light squares. There's like a blockade going on, and white's attack will eventually come on those light squares, whether it's through, that check, and probably just a direct, you're going to castle queenside at some point. You can put a pawn here if you wouldn't want to blunder it. You can attack on the H file. You can even think about this maneuver, right? I mean, black is just severely, severely weak on the light squares, and this bishop is of no help. Right? So it's a bad situation. You don't want to go into that as black. But I just wanted to illustrate to you, what it means to be really, really weak on a color complex. Well, you don't have to take this knight. You probably shouldn't. But then you have to live with the knight being quite a strong piece. And eventually white will probably be castling queenside and attacking you on the king side. So I think either of these moves would have been pretty good for me. Bishop g4 or pawn g4. I don't know. This one is maybe even like more thematic, right? Bishop g4. Just go for the trade of the light squared bishops. Well, I played knight de4, which, is supernatural, right? It's like, it is a piece improvement. You generally do want your knight on that square. So, I can't blame myself too much, but it is imprecise. And now this knight gets challenged, right? And if I go bishop d3, this is the difference, is that in a position like this, black has a move like g4, which is actually going to be, giving them a lot more counterplay. on the king side, it just doesn't allow white to establish as much control. Like black can do queen e8, queen g6, typical maneuver. You might even see them go h5 at some point. There's more of a chance for that bishop to improve, right? This is a very important little pawn move, and it's about counterplay for black. So that wasn't gonna be perfect. Okay, so I took the knight. And you know what I'm unhappy about here is that, well, this bishop is still on the board, and I haven't really established control over the e4 square yet. So I haven't achieved much by giving black those double pawns. It might look a little ugly for black, but it's really not that important in the big scheme of things as the control I would like to have over the light squares. So I go and I try to get it. Yes, something consistent, right? But black brings out the queen, sure. Now there's a latent threat against f2. So we are motivated to castle. And my student plays a very good move, pawn to e4. So you see, guys, I have not managed to establish control over those weak light squares, and black is solving the problems. This bishop is opening up, and I knew that things had not gone according to plan, but that's why this moment right here was such a key, because this was my big chance to get better, control over these squares. So as natural as knight d e4 was, it really had some drawbacks, which was that the knight just kind of couldn't, establish a stronghold here. So we tried to trade, but it was not the same. And after this move, rook a to e8, rook a to e1, kind of came a very interesting, instructive moment, like what black should do. I mean, he has some issues with his pawn in the sense that white maybe wants to take the bishop and take the pawn. At least it seems like that's one of the ideas. On the other hand, he doesn't really want to avoid the bishop trade because there's bishop e6. So my student faced kind of a challenging moment that, was not simple to navigate, but I'm going to show you what it was that he should have done. And the move is simple. It's just rook to e7. So it's like a flexible little rook move in the sense that you might triple up or you might double up there. There's a lot of flexibility. And you're basically saying, okay, white, you can take your pawn on e4 if you would like with that trade, if you're that interested in it. But actually, I guess it's more important that I'm going to get really, really super active pieces. Yes, that bishop has come to life and is exerting his powers over the position, which is why it's worth it to sacrifice a pawn to get a bishop like that. So we're actually threatening to just attack the pinned knight, and there's no more defense over it. And yeah, white is in really bad shape here. The extra pawn they have doesn't really matter. If they try to move their king, there's going to be pawn g4, and then there's going to be an unpleasant check on the h-file. So basically, white cannot really take this pawn. But in that case, what should white be doing in this position? It's not clear. Looks like black has quite active bishops and, actually good coordination of all his pieces. And this rook is sort of not doing much on f1, right? So basically black is doing fine. He just needs to consider that losing this pawn is not all that important and nothing needs to be done about it. All right, so what can we conclude from this little example, guys? Well, what we can conclude is that there was a battle going on for the light squares in this game. And there was a battle going on between the bishops, so the trade of these bishops was a very key theme. And if you want to get control of color complex, right, you realize like, hey, this bishop is really key for defending all the light squares, yes, then you will often have to think about how to remove him from the board, right? So that has to be like, when you see this position, you really kind of want to notice how key this bishop is, right? How he's the one who guards all these light squares. Without him, black just has a bunch of pawns in the dark squares and a bunch of holes on the light squares. So that's why we should be thinking about engineering a favorable trade and ultimately just taking over the light square complex. So it is kind of an advanced strategic idea, guys. Involves like envisioning what you would actually like to control on the chessboard, and understanding like the importance of these squares, and understanding like the best way to get control over them is remove the opponent's pieces that help them fight for those squares. That's why like having a favorable piece trade is such an important thing. And like really your goal for a position like this is to leave them with this bishop against a knight. That's like actually the ultimate goal, right? So it's like you're not even just satisfied with a trade of these guys. You actually would rather also get a trade of the knights as well. Like remove everything that could help them fight for the squares you're interested in, right? The bishop's bad, magnify his poor quality by trading off all the decent black minor pieces, and that is going to be a strategic victory for you. So there you go. Kind of advanced strategic lesson for the day. And I will see you guys when I get back from the American Cup in St. Louis.